back to the Fourth Way Podcast. In this episode, I had the opportunity to interview Aree Spivey of Failed Kingdoms. We cover a lot of ground, but there are two main discussions that I want to key you into before you listen. First, we discuss the idea of how we ground nonviolence and anarchism, which, for us as Christians, is extremely important. Is our belief grounded in the idea that we are nonviolent and free because we are made in the image of God, and God is by nature nonviolent and free? Or is our belief in nonviolence and anarchism grounded in the idea that God can decree whatever he wants, and he simply decreed that, for whatever reason, we ought to be nonviolent for the moment and ought to have no king but Christ? How one answers this question has huge bearings on other doctrines that will come into play. The second conversation piece, I think, which is particularly important, is our discussion on race and politics. Many black activists declare that it is a privileged arrogance which would call someone to not engage in politics. Blacks, they argue, must engage in politics because their very lives and freedom depend on changing and creating just legislation. How does Aree, as a black man, respond to this? I think he provided a powerful analogy in that he argues that blacks are really just seeking to take the same gun which has oppressed them and to use that weapon for themselves. Now, perhaps one thinks that's great, but we know where power eventually ends up taking people, and this gun is a weapon that nobody should wield. Aree points out that the irony of this is that many blacks, especially those who adhere to CRT, are arguing that there's a huge systemic injustice and that whites don't see their own privilege and biases. Yet these same advocates are arguing that we need to engage in the system, a system in which the vast majority of the voting populace are these blind, racist, and self-interested white people. How does advocating a participation in such a system hold any moral coherence, let alone any logical coherence? It doesn't, which is part of the reason that Aree and I are anarchists and are having this discussion. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Aree Spivey of Failed Kingdoms. But just to start off with, I would love for you to kind of just maybe give a brief introduction as to who you are and what you do and what got you on the path to Christian anarchism. Like, what was the catalyst? What was there an event or somebody influential?
Well, my name is Aree. I'm pretty much the only person. I mean, it was more than one person at one point, but I'm a part of don't call it a group. I'm Failed Kingdoms, pretty much. I didn't know exactly how to say it, but yeah, I rap, I produce, I sing a little bit, not that well, but I don't like necessarily hearing people saying my own stuff, so I do the best I can. And I've been making music virtually my whole life. I love every form of music, not just hip hop, pop, R&B, whatever you name it, gospel. So I've just always loved music, and I've always grown up in a culture and in an atmosphere, an environment where music has always been a really important feature of our of day-to-day life. So I just naturally, became a musician pretty much. I'm 27. I'll be 28 this year, I believe. I have a 1-year-old daughter. Her name's Camila, and I'm married to my beautiful wife, Maria. Next year will be 6 years of marriage. That's pretty much all I think people would need to know about me. I'm a Christian, obviously. And specifically in regards to anarchism, Christian anarchism, that is, I've always been skeptical of political authority, especially, where I came from and where I come from. My family has always raised me to be the type of person that looked and viewed what the government could potentially do to me if it wanted to, as in a not so positive light. And so I've naturally been a person that was skeptical of government. And I think that just naturally progressed into where I am now. At one point, I guess you could say I was a conservative. I was reading people like Thomas Sowell, um, Walter E. Williams, Jason Riley, even listening to conservative political pundits like Ben Shapiro, Steven Crowder. I still listen to Steven Crowder a lot. Don't agree with a lot of the stuff that he says because he's a statist, but he's relatively still enjoyable to watch and entertaining. Um, After a while, just listening to really reading Walter E. Williams, I was introduced to something called libertarianism, and never heard about it before. I had always grown up being a Democrat, right? So, like, the idea of big government was something that was always assumed where I came from. Um, Not really for me. It was I really didn't see the use of government for the majority of the time. And so, as I began to think about what government was needed for, I just naturally began to like X off certain things that it was meant to do, and that landed me into somewhere like a minarchist. Basically, you just need courts, you need maybe law enforcement, and that's it. That's pretty much it. And after that, I just started delving into more and more libertarian thought. I started reading Hayek. I started reading Rothbard. Murray Rothbard was one of the people that really sold me on anarchism. So I read his book. Well, it's not really a book. It's kind of like a short essay, and it's called what is it called? It's been so long. I think it's
Is it No Treason?
No, it's not No Treason. It's
Oh wait, you're talking about Rothbard.
Yeah,
not,
Rothbard.
Okay. Yeah, I read it. I'll look it up really quickly.
Yeah, I forget what it's called. It's like Man, Economy, and State or something like that. I can't remember. But either way, but I read that, and that pretty much sold me on anarchism as a political philosophy. But uh and after that, it just sort of I just started reading more and more people who are just in the anarchist group or anarchist philosophy. A lot of people from the Mises, I guess from the Mises side of political theory. I started reading a lot of them, and after a while, I just became convinced that there was really no need for political authority at all. We can pretty much, I guess, duplicate or replace the quote unquote necessary aspects of government with private institutions and private organizations. So that's kind of where I was, specifically with anarchism, and specifically when it comes to Christian anarchism. I became an anarchist way before I became a pacifist. So, but when I became a pacifist, that just seemed like the logical anarchism just sort of seemed like the logical conclusion of pacifism. So it was just sort of like I never planned on it, right? I wasn't intending to look at some kind of Christian way to justify anarchism. I was just reading, the words of Christ, and it seems like he's a pacifist, nonviolent, he has a nonviolent philosophy or a way of living, and that naturally made me become a pacifist. and just looking at the logical, the logical conclusion of pacifism, just even furthermore cemented my anarchism.
So it was, you were right. The book was called Man, Economy, and State.
Yes.
I read Anatomy of the State. I didn't. That's the only one I've read by Rothbard. But yeah, that was good and probably representative of his work. All right, so I want to kind of hone in on that because pacifism was a really big issue for me too. Like where anarchism wasn't even on the table. That's not even something I thought about. But the 2016 election kind of threw me for a spin, and with morality and everything, I started questioning a lot of things. But like you said, coming to pacifism, it's like, well, the logical outworking of that is if I can't bear the sword, then that's going to be a big problem bearing the sword for the state. But as you dig into pacifism, especially, you kind of get two camps of people. And so I'm going to try to talk with some other people who take a very maybe literal, I don't know what word they would prefer me to use, but literal interpretation of the Bible, where it's inerrant and face value. My impression of reading your stuff and hearing you talk, I've heard you. I just watched one of your interviews with, I think it's Brad Jersek.
Yeah.
So my impression of you is that you take and give me the word that you want me to use, maybe a little bit more of a loose interpretation of the Bible.
I guess so. I mean, because I'm certainly not an inerrantist. So I don't necessarily prefer even the vocabulary of me being an errantist, an errantist. But I think I'm sort of more of the text is alive, so to speak. I'm not trying to make it all fit, and I can clearly see when I read the text that there's problems, at least how I read it. There's inconsistencies, maybe contradictions, and that doesn't bother me. It just makes me look at the scriptures as a book of wisdom and not necessarily a rule book for life. So I look at the text like, hey, the scripture says this, but then the scripture also says this, and I don't necessarily conclude from that well, we can't know anything. I'm more of a person who says, okay, what is God trying to get us to say, or what is God trying to get us to conclude from this? And I think it's an invite to question, to live, to wrestle with this tradition that the Christian tradition and the Hebrew tradition, and that's how I see the scriptures. So I've seen so many times where I guess evangelicals or conservative Christians, when I bring up the fact that I don't really necessarily have a problem with the idea that Paul may have said this, but I don't necessarily agree with it, they bring up, then, okay, well, if Paul could potentially be wrong here, then how do how, like, what's the interpretative framework that you use to, I guess, exegete to pull truth from the text? And where I am is I don't really know officially. I don't really know how to deal with that other than the way that I deal with it now. And and it's almost like the way that people tend to say it is, you either have inerrancy and you have 100% trust in the text, or you can't trust anything. You can't trust anything about what the text says at all if you give up the idea that the scriptures are always true in what it says and the doctrines that it speak. but even if that was a, I guess, a legitimate problem posed to the scriptures, the point is that, and this is why I guess I'm still a Christian. I still see value in the Christian tradition. I still have what I believe to have been mystical experiences with Jesus. Sometimes I think I conclude that it's the God of the Bible to a certain extent, because every time I've ever had a mystical experience, it's always been through, I guess, through Christian practices. I don't necessarily know if that's actually Jesus, but I just conclude that it is, because of because of the situation that I'm in. But even then, it's like, I do believe that there's something to this. There's something to this tradition. There's something to this religion. There's something to this Jesus, and there's something to these texts, and that is what's making me stay. And so, with that, I have to learn how to deal with the text. I refuse to just throw it away. I have to deal with it in some way, shape, or form. And so, for me, I guess you could refer to me as someone who is a fallibilist in terms of scripture. But even then, I think I'm more in line with Second Temple Jewish ways of thinking about the text, because in Second Temple, well, and a lot of the times in Second Temple Judaism, you don't necessarily get this idea of the historical grammatical reading of the text being the utmost important thing about reading the text. That's never what it was. It was always, hey, that may be an important thing to parse out, but fundamentally, that's not the thing that's most important. The thing that is most important is wrestling with the text and doing the best that you possibly can without forsaking your own experiences, without forsaking your own context, without forsaking your own environment, and almost becoming like emptying yourself out just to read the text, and this is what it is. The point is, I don't think that that's even possible to begin with. I think that's requiring you to completely just it's requiring you to not be you anymore in order to read the text. And I just don't think that that's even remotely plausible. And so for me, I read the text and I embrace it for what it is. And I do the best that I can to interpret and to read it within my own context, within my own environment, within my own upbringing, and within my own tradition. And obviously, the historical grammatical reading of the text is very important. But just even when I read and when I look at history, even in the first century where the New Testament arises from, it even appears to me that is not the most important thing about the text. They, in a lot of ways, many Jews were okay with the idea that, okay, well, scriptures, this prophet says this and this prophet says that. And they almost look at that as, okay, well, okay, we see that, we recognize it, but the scripture is fundamentally, I guess, Peter ends, he says, I forget what he said, it's cryptic. Scripture is fundamentally cryptic. So it's not necessarily what you see on the top and on the front of the text. You got to, the truth, the real truth, you got to dive deeper into it. So you always have to look underneath, and it's skin deep. Well, it's not skin deep. It's more than skin deep. And so that's kind of how I read the text now. At least that's where I am now.
Yeah, and I know that sounds wishy-washy to a lot of people who hold to inerrancy, but I think it's not really fair, because inerrantists do the exact same thing, right? So, like,
right.
Take, for example, reading slavery in the Old Testament. Well, you see, it doesn't mean that God approves of slavery. He's using progressive revelation and whatnot. So they take things that are there at face value. Or if you're an old earth creationist, you take Genesis 1 and you recognize that there's a way, there are multiple ways to interpret different things. So I think inerrantists do the same sort of thing. I guess one of the big hangups, I think, for a lot of people, or one of the kind of a fork in the road that you have to come to, is you have to decide in regards to nonviolence. You have to say, okay, either I'm nonviolent because Jesus told me to, God told me to, and therefore I need to do that. He decreed it. Or God is by nature a loving God, and to love means to not do violence to somebody. So you take the second approach, right? You take God is by nature a loving God, which means he doesn't do violence.
Correct. Yeah, that is literally my position. Yes.
Okay. Which, yeah. So for if you're going to go that route, then anarchism makes 100% sense. Whereas if you say that, well, God can decree to not use the sword, but then he can give the government the sword and those sorts of things. You can kind of wiggle your way out of that one. All right. So if you view God's character as being intrinsically loving and good, and being loving and good means nonviolent, then you would say that Old Testament depictions of violence doesn't at all represent who God is. Is that correct?
Yeah, that would be correct. Yeah.
Okay. So, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, go for it.
Okay. Well, specifically with Old Testament violence, the thing about it is that, one, I don't even think a lot of it is even historically situated. Specific, for instance, like the Great Flood in the Book of Genesis. Obviously, I mean, I do believe that there was a Great Flood in like 5000 BC. I know that for a fact. That's scientifically provable. I know that. However, that's a different means of looking at history rather than looking at what the text says. And so for me, the idea that God, I guess, basically killed the entire human race and just kept a couple people alive. One of the moral objections that I have to that is the idea that God drowned babies. I mean, because it's a global flood. I mean, or whether or not you take a global view of it, or you take a local flood view. Either way, the point is, God killed babies, and that is extremely morally problematic to me. And if I had to believe that, I wouldn't be a Christian. And so I have moral objections to a lot of the stuff that Yahweh is said to have done. And then on top of that, I find that even the accounts that are brought forth are historically suspect to a certain degree. So I don't even think that I necessarily have to take a historical literalist view, just even off of the scholarship that we have right now, and off of the archaeological evidence for these particular instances of God being violent in the scriptures. So for me, one, I have moral objections to it. And then two, I don't necessarily think that I have to take that. Just even reading the text for what it is, I don't even necessarily think that I have to take that those particular instances are literal, due to the fact that scholarship and archaeology sort of pushes back on that conservative fundamentalist interpretation of those texts. So for me, any instance, I would say it straight up. Any instance of Yahweh doing any sort of violence, I automatically take that as either it's hyperbole, meaning that he didn't do it. Two, the Israelites are dealing with something that perhaps actually happened, like a great flood, because I really do believe that there was a great flood, and that's just something that was passed down through oral tradition, and it was, I guess, the way in which that the Israelites felt that they had to interpret the text. Well, that they had to interpret this historical event. They felt as if they had to interpret that as God punishing the human race. And I just would fundamentally take issue with the idea that Yahweh actually did it. I don't necessarily disagree with the idea that there was a flood. I disagree with the idea that with the attribution from the Israelites that Yahweh did it. And even in terms of like the Canaanite genocide, I have no problem with, well, historically, I don't think there's actually much evidence that it actually happened. But even if there was evidence that it actually happened, I wouldn't just, right off say, okay, Yahweh told them to do it. I would think, hey, they falsely believed that Yahweh told them to do it, because fundamentally, I don't think God is like that. So if I am existing in the Christian tradition, and I do have these biases, like I have these biases about who God is and what God does and what God won't do. Either way, I still have to interpret the text with those, I get, not even biases. They're more hermeneutical, I guess, foundations. So one of the ways that is one of my interpretational frameworks is that God is ultimately nonviolent, and he doesn't kill, he doesn't destroy. And with that, I take that and I read the text and I see that the Israelites are saying that Yahweh actually did these things, and I have to conclude that, I know for a fact that God isn't like this, so they must have been mistaken in some way. I don't know. I don't necessarily know how to harmonize it to make it make sense with a I guess with an nonviolent God. But either way, I just know for a fact that Yahweh didn't say this, or Yahweh didn't command this.
Well, so you take that to like the greatest extent that you can, correct?
Yes.
Like you take that to universalism.
Yes, absolutely. And the thing about universalism is that I just don't see how, because I'm involved in a lot of anarchist, pacifist kind of groups, and there's a lot of pacifists in these groups, but I don't see how they don't understand that pacifism, at least it seems to me, logically follows to universalism. Because if you have this idea that God is, well, obviously you have this idea where pacifists will say, well, God commanded us to be nonviolent, but that doesn't necessitate the idea that God must be nonviolent, which I don't think makes sense for what reason. But even if you are a pacifist and you take my position that God just doesn't command those kinds of things, I don't see how you can conclude that God isn't in the business of reconciling the entirety of creation to himself. Because if you're going to say, I guess my fundamental position is this: whether it's eternal conscious torment or whether it's annihilationism, which is basically the idea that God, everything is inherently, well, every rational spirit is inherently mortal, and it's only through God's grace, infusion of grace, of immortality. That's the only way in which you can receive salvation. And just by nature, everything else is mortal. And so if you have not received God's grace, then eventually you'll be annihilated. You'll be destroyed, ultimately destroyed. But the point is for me, even if you take a kind of passive approach to, passive approach to damnation, you still have this idea that God ultimately caused it, because God ultimately created. God is ultimately responsible for everything that comes about in creation. I don't see how you can't I don't see how you can conclude that God is, I guess, that God is ultimately good, and that God is ultimately nonviolent, and that God is ultimately peaceful, if you believe that God allows for, or actually positively, I guess, does does the destroying, or facilitates the idea of people being consciously tormented forever. I don't see how you can get past that. And so for me, the only way that pacifism works, in my opinion, is that God ultimately reconciles everything to himself. That's the only way that I can perceive of God not ultimately being responsible for the harm done to creation, is if he can ultimately save it and reconcile it and renew all of it. So that's the only way that I can see pacifism actually working, and it actually makes a bit of sense, you know. And so even with pacifism, I was just talking to, I don't know, yeah, you know, Craig, you interviewed Craig from the Bad Roman. We were just talking about this on the phone it was maybe like a couple weeks ago, maybe a month ago. And we were talking about the idea that, look, if God is ultimately nonviolent, if God is ultimately loving, if God is ultimately, this is ultimately peace, how do you go from that to God destroys some people, or God ultimately facilitates the ultimate harm of some of his loved ones? I don't see how that works, and I don't see how that actually makes sense. And so the only way that I can make sense of Christianity and where I am is to say that if God is nonviolent, God ultimately heals and, I guess, renews the entirety of creation, and he undoes the harm that we ourselves have perpetuated against each other and to ourselves. And the only way, and the reason that I say that is because God ultimately caused everything. God God didn't have, I guess, God wasn't pressured by anything outside of himself to create to create to begin with. And so whatever ultimate harm that befalls any of his creation, I think God is ultimately responsible for it. And because God doesn't perpetuate harm and he doesn't cause harm, God can't ultimately be the cause of any person's annihilation or any person's eternal damnation. So I think that's the only logical conclusion, is universalism.
Yeah, I think the hard part about taking the decree version of nonviolence is that, if you think, well, God just decreed for us to be nonviolent at this point, then what you're saying is, the nonviolent enemy love of Jesus doesn't really show us what God is like. It just shows us a tool that he's willing to implement for a certain period of time. And so it divorces enemy love and nonviolence from the character of God, and that's a hard pill to swallow for me.
And it seems. I mean, even with that, because it's like, okay, well, if enemy love entails the idea that you don't kill you don't kill people, at least like at the fundamental part. Let's just say enemy love is don't kill your neighbor, don't kill your enemy. I don't see how that works if you have the idea, specifically in the Old Testament, and not only in the Old Testament, but even when it comes to a lot of pacifists like, Greg Boyd. I love Greg Boyd, but he even embraces the idea of annihilation. So it's like, well, how is it that for us, killing our neighbor is a sign of hatred, is a sign of hate, is a sign of, I guess, antichrist sentiment. But when God does it, then for some reason it's completely detached from what he initially commanded of us. So it's like the more consistent position, it seems to me, is that if killing your neighbor or killing your enemy is ultimately hateful, but loving them is the ultimate of wanting their demise, then God would necessarily have to be the same thing. And if you don't say that, then it just makes it really difficult for me to see what love actually is and what mercy and what grace actually is, if God is just completely and wholly detached from the moral standards that he himself applied to us. So it just makes it really difficult to see, to understand and to notice and to discern what love and what grace and what mercy is, if God literally can do what he said we can't do, and it not be hateful and it not be hatred. So it makes it really difficult for me to even remotely see or understand who God is, if what he commands for us is something that he's not necessarily beholden to a certain extent.
All right, we'll have a little guest here, another one for a little bit longer.
That's fine. That's okay with me.
Yeah. So yeah, to what you were saying, I'm extremely sympathetic to universalism. It's hard for me to get there. I mean, I know there are ways that you can work the text, but what started to convince me that it's acceptable is I was reading Gregory Nyssa's on the soul and the resurrection or something to that extent, and I read something and I was like, he sounds like a universalist, but he can't be because he's a Christian. He's a like one of the church fathers, like a really important guy. And you come to discover, oh, this tradition that I've been handed is great, it's valuable, but we leave out so much of the ante-Nicene and the early church, even post-Constantinian, which Nyssa was. And so that made me do a little bit of research and understanding that, okay, even if I'm not a universalist, like I love universalists. I love the passion that they have, the love that they have for people, that aspect of God. And then reading David Bentley Hart, his book, That All Shall Be Saved, was, man, that is philosophically really rich for universalism and theologically.
I don't. When it comes to that, the first meditation is, I mean, even the fourth meditation on the rational will. I've read that book almost. I think I've read the book 10 times since it came out, and the first meditation, I think it's the most, I guess, undefeatable argument for universalism that I've ever come across. I've read people who critiqued the book and who critiqued David, but at the end of the day, I've never really heard a sufficient answer to his first meditation about creatio ex nihilo, about who God would be if he allowed for the kind of world to exist that most Christians tend to believe in. And I read that first chapter. I read the first meditation, and I was like, okay, well, if I was on the fence before, I'm not now. So that is a powerful argument in my opinion, specifically the first meditation.
Yeah, it's a great book. So speaking of Hart, he is Eastern Orthodox.
Yes,
and I know that you had toyed around with Orthodoxy for a bit, and before coming to Romania, I did a bit of research into Eastern Orthodoxy, and there are a lot of things that I really like about it. In particular, they do a really good job of bringing in the senses, the smells, the sights, and incorporating the whole person, and doing the same thing with Jesus. It's not just like my Protestant background. It's very transactional, death, burial, resurrection. He paid my debts, but there's not really a true emphasis on the life of Christ. And so there's a lot I really appreciate about Orthodoxy with their rituals and things that just really ground you. But at the same time, I recognize, and I mean, like, this is prime example over here in Romania, right next to Ukraine and Russia, right? Orthodox heavy places, and you've got the patriarchs who are sanctioning the war in Russia, and you've just got this sacralism that's just embedded into so much of Orthodoxy. And it's interesting because the things that I think the Orthodox do very good to kind of get you involved and incorporate you with their rituals, you see the state doing the exact same sorts of things. So I don't know if you have any insight from the time that you're toying around with Orthodoxy in terms of sacralism, how the state uses religious sorts of things or co-opt religion. But I'd love any insight you have into that, since you love heart, you've toyed around with Orthodoxy, but you're also not a statist, and you recognize the problems of merging government and religion.
Yeah, you already brought him up, but Brad Jerzak, he's also an Eastern Orthodox Christian, and I mean, honestly, both of them, at least talking to Brad, he made me more sympathetic to it. Specifically when it comes to Hart is not an anarchist. He's a statist, but specifically when it came to Brad, because of his theology, which seemed more true and more inviting to me, it almost like shocked me that he was Orthodox. But he made me become sympathetic to it, and so obviously I was toying around with Orthodoxy, and I was literally attending an Orthodox church at that point, and I loved it. Like you said, it incorporates all of the senses. It incorporates smells, feels, hearing. Everything is beautifully painted on the walls, and you have candles, and it's beautiful. It's a beautiful experience, and it's actually outside of my own comfort zone, because I grew up and I was raised Protestant, so that's pretty much all I ever knew. And with Protestants, specifically when it came to the churches that I was in, it looks more like a concert than, I guess, than a temple, But specifically when it came to Orthodoxy, one of the main reasons why I sort of jettisoned that pursuit, at least for now, is that one, I saw a lot of the statism that was inherent in a lot of priests and a lot of speakers, and even when I read Orthodox history, like, there's a lot of being in bed with the state that I just fundamentally found, distasteful. And I even read this book. Is about, I actually think he was a Protestant, and then he converted to Orthodoxy. He's a Orthodox scholar, and he did an entire book. I think it's literally called Mere Orthodoxy, if I remember. It may not be that, but he devotes an entire chapter to the idea of how the Orthodox Church was in bed with the state in whatever periods it may have been in. And that really just turned me off. Like, I literally cannot stand politics. I cannot stand the government. I think hate is probably too strong of a word, but like, if the government collapses tomorrow, like, that would be my birthday gift for the rest of the year. But specifically when it comes to the Orthodox, one of the things that I really found that it does is that, one, people really devote their lives to, well, not their lives, but they have a lot, like a strong devotion to their priests, almost more. I would even say more strongly than Protestants have to their pastors. And when it comes to that, I just began to see so many priests coming out in support of statism, whether it be on the right or the left, right? And that would just turn me off, because I would just realize that maybe um, they're basically doing the same thing that turned me off to a lot of Protestant pastors and a lot of Protestant denominations. They are they're being used by the government to do these, presidential prayer breakfasts and all this different type of stuff. And specifically when it came to Orthodox priests and Orthodox Christians who, I guess, hold sway among the Orthodox population, I would just see that they're kind of doing the same thing with um with the government. Whether it may not be necessarily in America, because there's not really a big population of Orthodox Christians in America, but specifically like overseas, especially in like Russia. Like, you have Orthodox priests, you have archbishops, you have all these people, and they are literally shilling for the Russian government. And that turns me off completely. And especially when it came to the parish that I was attending, we're basically at that point it was basically I forget what it's called, but it's like our our parish is somehow connected to the Russian Orthodox Church in Russia. And so basically Russians came over, and then they established at least to a certain extent, they established the American Orthodox Church. And so there's still connections. So there's a lot of connections to it. And that was something that really turned me off to at least the parish that I was going to, because that's their authority figure. Like the Russian priesthood over there is their authority figures, more so than anything over here in America. But it just really turned me off to Orthodoxy to a certain extent, because like there's not much. I think I can count on my left hand and just use one finger how many Orthodox libertarians or anarchists that I've ever met. And the point is that they are extremely okay with the idea of using government to bring about whatever they feel like they need to bring about. And even there's another Orthodox priest named Josiah Trenum, I think. And fundamentally, he was talking about how, I guess, homosexuals are able to get married and all this different type of stuff, which I don't care. I don't really care about that idea. Like, as long as they don't try to force me or force anybody else to do something that they want us to do, then I don't care. They can get married. I don't care. And so the thing that really almost terrified me was he was talking about it. And I'm talking about, it's a big parish. I think maybe almost a mega church it looks like. And the just authority that he had to say that marriage is solely between a man and a woman, which I don't disagree with, but he's almost saying that it should be illegal to practice to be involved in a homosexual relationship. And it's like, man, being a libertarian and being an anarchist, I fundamentally disagree with that. And after that, it just sort of just being involved in certain Orthodox circles, I just began to see so much of the statism just come up. And I would say it's almost as worse as what you see in American evangelical churches. So it's almost as worse. It's almost as worse. And but I would say it's, to a certain extent, it's even worse, because I've seen so many Orthodox Christians advocate for the idea of of monarchy. Like literally, there's this guy named Jay Dyer on YouTube. He's an Orthodox Christian, pretty big, and he has a substantial following. And he fundamentally advocates for the idea that we should have kings. And you see that a lot with a lot of Orthodox Christians, and that turns me off so much. Like there's the advocation of statism in Orthodox Christianity just completely turned me away. That's not the fundamental reason why I kind of like put that on hold, but it fundamentally turned me away from Orthodoxy because of the statism that is inherent within not only their theology, but is also inherent within the way that they I guess um within the way that they practice Christianity. They are almost more bold than Protestant Christians when it comes to advocating more tyrannical more tyrannical control over the populace. They literally advocate monarchy. At least a lot of them do. And that is something that I fundamentally just said, okay, that was overwhelming. And I was like, okay, I'm gonna have to push back a little bit, and I'm gonna have to, regroup. And then maybe further on in the future, I'll go ahead and you know, just maybe think about it again. But other than that, I was completely turned off from Orthodox Christianity.
Yeah. Yeah, I understand that. So, last question here. I haven't seen very many black anarchists. I'm sure they exist. And so I don't know all the reasons for that, but the sense that I have is that, you hear a lot of black people talking, and in terms of politics, they talk about how, like anarchism or non-participation, if I'm going to refuse to vote, because I just don't like any of the candidates, a lot of them will say, well, that's a privilege that you have because there's nothing that really, really impacts you that much. And so it's hard for me to really speak into that because, I understand if my group was oppressed for a long, long time and there's still hangovers of that and still effects and impacts and still legislation and the justice system and all that kind of stuff, it's easy for me to say, I'm just not going to participate. But, I've heard a lot of black political activists saying that's irresponsible and that's unjust to refuse participation to help.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure you've probably dealt with a whole lot more pushback from people, but I'd love to know, have you heard those accusations? And then secondly, how do you respond to that?
Well, I guess I would. I mean, that's kind of the reason why I cited. Well, I didn't cite. I just basically brought up Walter E. Williams, Thomas Sowell, all of those black intellectuals who they're not liberal and they're not progressive, and they don't necessarily buy into the idea that I guess racism is so detrimental to black people nowadays. And for me, I wouldn't deny the idea that systemic racism exists. I wouldn't deny the idea that I guess that racism is a bad thing, and that racism has harmed and has done systematic harm to black people, and maybe even now. I'm more so of a person who thinks that you just have to deal with the fact that racism isn't going anywhere. One, two, deal with the fact that I think that black society, that the black culture, and especially for me, just as a black man, we can do so much more to contribute to our own well-being than what a lot of these activists tend to say that we can. because they attribute so much of it to, to the inequities that are caused by racism and things like that. I think for me, I don't see any solutions to, I guess, basically engaging in politics at all, because I feel like I feel like I've gotten a good enough history lesson from what the government has done to people that look like me, that turns me off to ever thinking that course of action, like voting and being in politics, it's just scarred me too much to ever think that I would ever need to utilize that path towards, I guess, liberation. And so for me, I look at government as fundamentally a gun, which is fundamentally what it is. And looking at what, my grandmother, she grew up in the 50s. She was born in the 50s. So she went and experienced Jim Crow, right? So it's not like I'm completely turned off to the idea that racism is horrible. My grandmother is still alive. Jim Crow wasn't that long ago. I mean, just looking at the span of how long America has been here. So I wholly understand that there are still racial inequities that occur in this country, that there's still things that can be done and that can be improved. I just don't think that utilizing the same gun that was used to oppress us in the past is a good enough solution, because you still have the gun is still there. Like, who's to say? Because when it comes to these kinds of people, they'll say that the culture is still systemically racist. So they're saying that there's still a bulk of the American populace that's still racist. And they'll say, hey, politicians, police officers, there's still a lot of them who are still benefiting from and even perpetuating the idea that America is systemically racist. Why would I want to give them the gun to potentially do what you say it's doing again? So for me, I'm more so of a person who I think I just think my solution, not necessarily my solution, but my position, whether it be a passive solution or whether it be a passive position or not, I just think that my position in the end will cause less harm than their positions will. Because either way it goes, you acknowledge that the government has done and perpetuated all of these inequities and have perpetuated all of these tyrannical things on us. And then you say, out the other side of your mouth, you say, all right, let's take that same gun and make with it what we do. I mean, make with it what we would want to happen. But then you simultaneously say, we're still dealing with a systemically racist society, and all of our institutions still involve racism. And I just don't find that to be a very smart move. Why would you continue to legitimize the institutions that once oppressed you, and you still say the same people that are currently involved in these institutions right now are still occupying these positions, and they still have the same sentiments to a certain extent as those people did back in the day? I don't see any reason or any justification to then say we should still legitimize the same institutions, because of, if you don't, you're giving power to the oppressors again. It's like, well, either way it goes, they still have the power whether or not. So for me, I just say I would say the idea that, I guess, being passive about politics is irresponsible. I think utilizing the gun that was used to oppress you, and you are still sitting by the same people that you claim are oppressing you when they could potentially get the gun again, I think that's more irresponsible, because that could lead to more tyrannical practices in the future. So I think it's sort of it's a very complicated issue, but I think my position makes a little bit more sense than the position that they're prodding out. And obviously, there's been people who have come up to me, and I'll tell them straight up, I don't vote. I never will. I think that signals that you're legitimizing the organization that was used to, that oppressed us in the past. And they'll say, "Yo, well, we need it. It's necessary because of this or that and this or that." And it's like, I just can't get past the idea that I'm basically getting in the same car that all of these, and getting in the same car and potentially, that's a bad analogy, but using the same gun, I guess, to get what I think needs to be done. And potentially the next year, the people that I claim to be my oppressors can get the gun back. So I think my solution would be is to just do away with the gun. Just do away with the gun, and you won't have that, because I think that a racist person without the state, I just think is just, I think he's powerless, honestly. So if you have a racist person with the state, that's potentially genocide. A racist person without the state, that's just a racist person with bad ideas.
Yeah,
and I'm not afraid of a racist person. I'm afraid of a racist person with a badge on them. I'm not afraid of a racist person who's just sitting there. So what? So I think it's just bad. It's bad. It's a bad way to live, to think that the same institution that was used to oppress you, that you could potentially use it in a good way. I just don't think it's plausible. And I think when you look at the history of the way that governments tend to do, they tend to become oppressive, and they tend to become and descend into tyranny. And on top of that, so with that, and then on top of the fact that racism was literally perpetuated by the government, I just find it extremely irrational to ever believe that it would be okay to participate in the political system.
Yeah, I like those analogies, and talking about the harm an individual can do versus the harm that a group with power can do. And it also reminds me a lot of CRT. I think it's a shame that there are so many people in some of the groups that we run in, but then also the conservatives who supposedly want to limit the state. They're very anti-CRT, and I'm like, you guys are crazy. You should be all about CRT, because not only does it make accurate observations, okay, I don't like their solutions, which is why I think so many people don't like CRT, because it basically wants government to do stuff. But its observations are spot on. It's exactly what you just said. It says, hey, look, government says that they fix our problems with legislation, but what they really do is they shift the problem to somewhere else. Okay, they got rid of slavery. No, there's debt peonage and there's sharecropping. It's really slavery. Okay, well they give minorities the right to vote. Yeah, but then they disenfranchise them through the war on drugs, right? Well, CRT makes all those observations, and they essentially say the government's worthless. It doesn't fix the problems. But then CRT goes on to say, so let's use the government to fix this problem. So I think your observations are spot on. I think it's exactly what CRT observes. It's just your solution is a far better one than CRT proposes.
Yeah, and because honestly, I think I would fundamentally agree with, because okay, when it comes to me, like I think white liberals, in my opinion, because honestly, I'm literally not a political person. I mean, I have political views, but I don't follow politics that much. It doesn't. I have no idea what President Biden is doing right now. I don't know, and I just never will, and I don't care. So but for me, I think that one of the things that has just made it just made at least Black people's predicament even worse is the fact that I honestly do believe that if white people had not necessarily decided to help us, I'm more of a Malcolm X kind of guy than a Martin Luther King kind of guy. I'm more of a person who would say, not necessarily in a not necessarily in a defensive phraseology, but I'm more of a person who say, look, people racists out there don't care. Do whatever you need to do. If you want to be racist, go be racist over there. I don't need you. I don't need your help. When it comes to people who claim that they need my help, I don't need your help. I can do it myself. You guys have helped enough. Your solutions obviously aren't helping. Like for me, it's always been, and I guess this is why I don't necessarily refer to myself as a liberal or progressive, because I think I almost cringe when I see, and not necessarily saying it's a bad thing, but I almost cringe when I see white people trying to like almost defend us, not necessarily saying it's a bad thing. I don't get mad, but it's more so of a realization that when white liberals in particular and white progressives have like attempted to help us in the past, it's all that is done is make it worse, And for me, when I hear stuff like that, like, yo, hey, look, we have white privilege, or we do whatever, and I acknowledge that white privilege exists. I don't care. It's not really a big thing for me, but one of the things that make it difficult for me to get on board with the idea, specifically, like, okay, with CRT, fine, they make a lot of valid observations about the world and about what the government, what solutions may be the best solution for us. And it's like, okay, you guys have been doing this for so long and it doesn't work because fundamentally your argumentation is proper, but your statism is getting in the way and it's hurting us. So for me, I can't even stomach the idea of, like, specifically like white liberals trying to, I guess, help me and help us, because I just see that it doesn't actually help anything. It really doesn't help anything. And so this is fundamentally the reason why I'll say, hey, I think the solution is put down the gun that was used to oppress us, and let's work on it ourselves. Because if what you guys are saying, basically that, that the white population, they fundamentally don't care about where we are, and and they're benefiting from this system and whatnot. It's like, okay, fine, let's just say that that's true. I don't think it's true. I think the majority of white people in this country are cool. I don't think most people have negative views about me just because of my skin color. I think most white people are lovable people. But for me, if you're going to take the idea that that we live in a society that oppresses us because of our skin color, I don't see why you would want to exercise your right to vote when you have a populace that is almost 70% white. But you also say the vast majority of them are racist, or they benefit from a society, they benefit from a system that is racist, and they don't want to give up their privileges. It's like, okay, all of the arguments that you use to make that case, like 80-90% of the time, government's behind it. Like, whether it's redlining, whether it's Jim Crow, it doesn't matter, just name it. All of that stuff fundamentally comes from the fact that whites in the past utilized the government to to bark up more inequities and inequalities, right? So it's like, why would you? I just don't get, why do you insist on utilizing the state institution when, one, you know what it does, you know what it could potentially do to us, and two, you know for a fact that the vast majority of people in this country are white, and you also say we live in a systemic society and they benefit off of this, the racism. What do you expect is going to be the result of that type of stuff? I just literally don't get why more black people aren't at least at minimum libertarians and at maximum anarchists. I just don't get it, because I think the logical conclusion to looking at the history of what Black America has gone, Black society, Black culture has, not Black culture, but Black people have gone through in this country, is anarchism. I say throw away the whole thing, and let's see if we can get it out the mud and do it ourselves, because I don't see the government shrinking. I see the government becoming more overreaching, and I think it inevitably could potentially go back into where it was, and that is oppressing minorities, because that's kind of what you guys already say anyway. That's what you're supposing. Anyway. That's why you don't want Republicans and conservatives in office, because you think it is going to lead to the oppression of minorities. Why do you continue to subsidize and legitimize this particular institution that you think is going to, could potentially oppress us again? I don't see why you just don't do away with it.
Well, that's exactly what a democracy is. It's the oppression of a minority by a majority, or
Very
maybe
much so.
Oppression's a harsh word sometimes, but I mean, sometimes it literally is, like you said. Well, I've got kiddos who woke up, and I would love to continue, but I enjoyed it. We'll have to do it again sometime.
Yeah, and I'm sorry. I ramble. I should have warned you before we even started. I ramble a lot.
Well, I invited you. This is about you getting to share your thoughts. So whatever you shared was fantastic, and we can do it again sometime.
Yeah, I look forward to it.
All right. I appreciate you taking the time out of your day.
Yes, sir. Appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. That's all for now. So peace, and because I'm a pacifist, when I say it, I mean it. This podcast is a part of the Kingdom Outpost Network. Please check out the links below to find other great podcasts and content related to nonviolence and kingdom living.